This lesson is all about sidechain compression. Now you probably already have used this in the music production stage if you've triggered some compression with a kick drum for instance, but if not, don't worry because we're going to cover it in this lesson. But actually it's much more of a powerful mixing tool than that, and with regards to the 4D mixing space, it actually controls the time dimension more so than the frequency or the depth or the stereo field. So what sidechain compression is, in a nutshell, is when the signal from one sound triggers the compression in another sound. So you might have a kick drum on channel A, and that might be triggering compression on a synth on channel B, for instance. But rather than just chat about it, let's jump into the door and I'll show you exactly what sidechain compression is and how we can use it to get the best mixes possible. So sidechain compression, as I said, is used to control the time dimension of our 4D mixing space. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So the most popular use of it in electronic dance music is on the bass line and other elements. And we use it by triggering compression on these elements with the kick. And that carves out space in the frequency spectrum for a specific period of time before that sound comes back in again. Now the most famous song that brought this to the wider attention of the production community was Call on Me by Eric Prydz. The technique's been around for longer than that, but that is really synonymous with this technique. So here we have our bass line playing and our kick. Now lots of those frequencies are clashing when the kick and the bass are playing at the same time. So I'll just show you what the sidechain compressor does. This is off and then on. So you can hear it's kind of got this pumping effect going on with the bass, which is allowing the kick to cut through the mix without cluttering up the headroom with extra frequencies that we don't need, or rather by doubling up frequencies on the bass and the kick at the same time. Like I said, this is the most common use and you can use it on other channels as well, and it's quite a creative option on the higher frequency ranges because it's so obvious to our ears that it's happening. So let's try it on our piano. So you can obviously really hear that pumping happening there. So now we know what kick triggered sidechain compression is, let me show you the best way I found to do it. There are a few ways and I'm going to go through all three of them. The first is my preferred technique, which is to load up a separate sampler with a very simple tick sound. So not a kick at all, but a very short, sharp, high sound. So I'm using a rim shot in this instance, and I'll explain why I do that in a minute. I make sure that the audio from that sidechain click track is routed to sends only, so it's not actually coming out the speakers, it's just the signals there in the background that we can call upon and route into other devices, like the compressor for instance. So with our bass line, I've just opened the sidechain option, and I think all DAW stock compressors have this now, so there's no excuse not to be able to use it. So you just choose where you want the sidechain to be triggered from. And the best way to do this is to whack the ratio right up, whack the threshold right down, make the attack as small as possible so the compression's hitting straight away when the kick's happening so the kick can cut through. And remember, this works for all genres of electronic dance music, not just house. And then start tweaking the release until you get the correct amount of pump that you want. So here we can see our gain reduction. If the release is too long, we can see the bass is never actually reaching its normal volume, which is here. And here it's too fast and the kick's not having a chance to cut through. So you just increase the release until it's in rhythm with the track. And this works even if it's not a 4/4 drum beat. But make sure that your bass line or whichever track you're sidechain compressing reaches its full volume so there's no gain reduction between every pulse. Otherwise you're just reducing the volume of the whole track rather than creating the sidechain pump that we want. Okay, two other ways of doing this. One is to route the actual signal from the kick track. So instead of having a dedicated sidechain track, you can just choose your kick input, and let's hear what the difference is. You see our kick drum is a lot longer than the very short sharp tick that I use for my dedicated sidechain track. So the compression is happening for a lot longer with each pulse. So the release would have to be set much lower to compensate for the length of the kick drum. Now some people prefer this because they argue that the shape of each kick drum is different, which it is, so the sidechain compression kind of gels more harmoniously into the track if it's using the actual shape of the kick rather than a different sidechain sound. Personally, I prefer the control that having a short, sharp tick gives me. Now the third way that you can do this is by using a third-party plugin. One example is the LFO tool, which is basically just an automated gain control. So let's turn off the sidechain compressor and see what this does. We'll set the rate to 1 and 4 so it's happening every beat. Adjust it to control the volume. That's off, and this is on. Now there are other plugins that do this, a popular one of which is Nicky Romero's Kickstart plugin. I've included links to both the LFO tool and Nicky Romero's Kickstart plugin below this lesson, so you can check those out if you prefer. But as I say, my preference is to use a separate sidechain track, make sure it's silent, and then just trigger the sidechain compression using that. The fourth bonus way that you can do it is actually by manually automating the gain on whichever channel you're sidechain compressing, like this for instance. We will just automate the volume on the bass line. So we can see here that we are creating a sidechain effect. Now that does give you the most control, but it's very painstaking. We are actually going to look at this in a later video in this course about absolutely maximizing the loudness when we send our final mix down to be mastered. But as I've said, you probably already know about sidechaining the kick drum. So how else can we use sidechain compression when we are mixing? Well, we can use it again to control the time and the frequency dimensions by ducking certain other elements when more important elements come in. So for instance, imagine one of our most important elements is the vocal of a track. But we have a synth that clashes with the same frequencies in the vocals. What we can do is actually trigger a sidechain compressor on the synth track, but as an input choose the vocals. And then what's happening is when the vocals are playing, they're actually compressing the synth track, or whichever track we've chosen to apply the compression to. Let's listen carefully and hear what happens when I apply this. Now I've made this very extreme so you can hear, but as you can hear, the synthesizer is being compressed using the vocals as a trigger. Now this is usually a very subtle mixing technique, so you don't really want it to be audible, but it works especially well on choruses where you've got a lot of elements going on, but you really need your vocal line or your lead synth to just cut through the mix. This is a great way to do it. You can also use this on your auxiliary channels as well to make extra space. So if you've got your reverb, for instance, let's pump it up so we can hear what's going on. And make it longer. Quite often this is where you get a lot of mud and the vocals can get washed out and lost in the mix. So listen what happens when we apply some sidechain compression being triggered by the very vocals that this reverb is working for. Obviously, this is a very extreme example just so you can hear what's going on, but that is a great way to make sure that your reverb doesn't wash out your main vocals or lead synth and create lots of mud. I hope that's made sense and you can see the power of sidechain compression, and we're going to stick with compression for one more video and cover off that so often misunderstood tool, a multi-band compressor. So I'll see you in the next lesson.